Right, welcome ladies and gentlemen. The BBC as we know it could be dead, genuinely. And I say that because of the Trump lawsuit. Now wait, don't just click off the video. This isn't me sort of glorifying the Trump lawsuit. It's just talking about it and how that's going to affect things moving forwards for the British broadcaster. So the BBC is the basically publicly funded broadcaster in the UK. Most countries have one, much to their sort of, citizens' annoyance. They effectively have to pay for a public broadcaster. Some countries factor the payment for this broadcaster into like local taxes and governmental taxes. In the UK, we have this thing called the TV license, which is basically a tax, and that's how the BBC is funded. But Trump is suing them for a lot of money. Now, I don't know how this is going to go, and again, this isn't kind of glorification of the lawsuit itself, but it's to discuss a pretty major situation in media. Right? This is huge in media. This isn't about the political ramifications. This is just the media ramifications. So don't click off the video, okay? It's not a political video. It's just about the BBC and the media landscape. Because this is, again, pretty huge, as you can see here. Trump sues the BBC for $10 billion. $10 billion. The BBC doesn't have 5 billion, let alone 10 billion. Right? The BBC is struggling as an entity. And it's struggling because people don't like what the BBC as a broadcaster is selling. They hate what the BBC is selling. So in the UK, the BBC is effectively what you could call the establishment propaganda arm. And I say that because imagine what Hollywood has been putting out lately. It's that cranked up to 11. Spinal Tap reference for you there. And it really is. Like Drag Queen Story Hour, trans this, trans that, ancient Britons were black. It's all that. Any show about the British Empire, all nasty, all derogatory, all negative. It denigrates what it is to be British and English. So they've been struggling for a while. I mean, the best case in point as an example for what the BBC produces and why they struggle is Doctor Who. They gave Doctor Who, they turned Doctor Who into I think he's second generation or first generation Rwandan immigrant, Ncuti Gatwa. And just was like, yep, sure, be yourself. That's Doctor Who now. So the quintessential core of what Doctor Who was, they just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So that's why the BBC is struggling. People have been checking out from the BBC for some time. Their ratings are in the toilet. Despite the British population growing massively, like hugely, in fact, the ratings are way worse than they've ever been. And people are checking out from even buying the TV license. So, although I said you have to have a TV license, you don't actually have to have a TV license. Unless you're watching the BBC and live TV. But people aren't doing any of that. And that's why the British government's been talking about having to have a TV license for just having Netflix and all this other nonsense. Because they're trying to keep the BBC alive. Whereas if they really question themselves and the sort of validity of the BBC, if they were being really honest with themselves, if this was floated on the private market, it had to stand for itself, it would fall apart. The BBC is being propped up massively by governmental figures. And again, this isn't a political video, but it just goes to show that the media, the mainstream media itself, and this goes right down into some of their programming, which I will say, to be objective and fair, some of the programming the BBC does put out is actually quite good when it's outsourced, when it's bought. I guess one of the prime examples of it would be, a good stuff like Peaky Blinders, for instance. Right, that's a good show, objectively quite a good show. But the majority of the BBC stuff's dog shit. So anyway, worth covering, because Trump suing them will probably kill them massively. 10 billion. That's pretty major. So here are the facts as they're reported by Sky News. Trump has filed a defamation lawsuit against the BBC, alleging the corporation's Panorama documentary portrayed him in a false, defamatory, deceptive, disparaging, inflammatory, and malicious manner. That's what the lawsuit says. So the complaint relates to the broadcaster's editing of a speech he made in 2021 on the day his supporters stormed the Capitol building. Just repeating what the article says. So clips were spliced together from sections of the US president's speech on January 6, 2021, to make it appear he told supporters he was going to walk to the US Capitol with them to fight like hell. So that documentary aired. It's called Trump, A Second Chance, and that was broadcast by the BBC a week before last year's US election, which is a bit weird anyway, like so close and having that edit. The implication is that the edit is designed, this is the implication, is designed to make people question voting for him, basically. So the US president is seeking damages of no less than $5 billion under a defamation lawsuit, but he's also sued for $5 billion for alleged violation of a trade practice law. Both lawsuits have been filed in Florida, and he said, quote, "They put words in my mouth." Speaking in the Oval Office earlier on Monday, at the time of recording this, "In a little while you'll be seeing I'm suing the BBC for putting words in my mouth. Literally, they put words in my mouth. They had me saying things that I never said coming out." Not strictly true. They've sequenced it in a way which wasn't said. He did say those things, but they've sequenced it in a way which implies he said something else. So the BBC is saying that they're going to fight it, and this is the BBC reporting on the BBC, which is comical as hell. Self-evidently, the BBC has a big decision to make if it hoped the US president might not follow through on his threat to sue. The reality check has arrived. So now it is about gaming out the options, but current indications are it plans to fight. "We will be defending this case," the BBC repeated, after the $5 billion lawsuit was filed over an edit of Donald Trump's January 6, 2021 speech in a Panorama documentary. So, yeah, pretty crazy. And apparently the government is going to back the BBC, or is backing the BBC as well, which is not a massive surprise because, again, in the UK we have these things called freedom of information requests, and basically you can request the government transparency about certain things. And on a freedom of information request by journalist and friend Lewis Brackpool, it was revealed. I've got to try and choose my wording carefully and remember what was revealed. But basically, it was revealed, I'm sort of paraphrasing, that the government had worked with broadcasters, including the BBC, to shape social narrative control. So it's not a stretch or a surprise that the government is going to want to back the BBC and keep them afloat. So that's it. The BBC could die from this. That's not a stretch at all. $10 billion. I mean, he's shooting for the stars here, isn't he? So, this isn't a political video. This is just the facts. It's a fascinating turn of events. I do wonder which way it'll go. It'll be very, very interesting. And on a geopolitical scale, just very briefly, a bit of politics. How would that shape things moving forwards? Will there be any more tensions? I wonder. It is interesting, though, nonetheless. So the BBC could be dead from this. Is dying. Who knows? Could go bankrupt. What do you guys think? Let me know down below. Bye-bye now.